Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a really interesting economic investigation that has emerged over the past few months. As you'll know, ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, there's been an ongoing debate about the true state of the Russian economy. The Kremlin says the economy is performing well, official figures have shown growth, Russian officials have repeatedly argued that sanctions have failed and the country has successfully adapted to the challenges created by the war. However, not everybody is convinced. And one country in particular has been taking a much closer look at what's actually happening beneath the headlines. And that country is Sweden. Now, before we get into the details of all of this, if you're enjoying my videos, could you hit that subscribe button, please? It really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. And I'd also like to remind you that my competition, where you come in my property or a cash alternative prize, is very close to its conclusion. It's closing at 5 p.m. UK time on the 12th of June. That's around about midday New York time and 9 a.m. Los Angeles. So if you're in the US and you want to get involved, then you need to do it by, well, straight away, really. So if you've been thinking about getting involved, now's the time to do it. Scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below, which will take you through to the independent company hosting the competition on my behalf. Good luck to everybody that's involved. Everyone's got an equal chance. Now, let's get back to talking about Sweden, because rather than simply accepting Russia's economic statistics at face value, Swedish analysts have been looking at ways to independently assess what's really happening inside Russia. And one of the methods they've been using is satellite imagery. Now, normally when satellite images of Russia appear in the news, they're linked to military activity. Perhaps a build-up of troops near the border, the movement of military equipment, aircraft at an airbase, naval vessels in a port. That's usually what intelligence agencies are interested in. But this time, they're looking for something completely different. Street lighting, industrial zones, commercial districts, transport hubs, and power consumption. And entire cities are being viewed from space after dark. And the reason is actually quite simple. Economic activity leaves clues. A factory operating through the night obviously shows that it's busy. A busy logistics centre that's working 24/7 tells you that there's a lot going on. A port loading cargo at all times of the night tells you that there's lots of demand. And a city filled with business activity tells you that there is lots and lots of electricity being used because people and businesses need it. And many of those clues can actually be observed from space. The brighter an area becomes, the more economic activity is taking place in that area. The darker it is, the more questions analysts start asking. Now, this isn't a brand new technique that Sweden has suddenly invented. Economists have been using nighttime luminosity data for decades. It's been used to estimate economic activity in countries where reliable information is difficult to obtain. It's been used to study growth in Africa and places in developing areas of Asia, and perhaps most famously, it's been used to assess activity inside North Korea, where official information is extremely limited and essentially non-existent. So this is a recognised analytical tool. It's not perfect. No one's suggesting that GDP can be calculated simply by counting light bulbs, but it does provide another way of looking at what's happening. And that's where things start to get really interesting in Russia, because Swedish officials have publicly questioned whether Russia's official economic statistics are presenting the full picture. In particular, Swedish Finance Minister Elisabeth Svantesson has pointed to satellite observations as one of several indicators suggesting that Russia's economy may not be performing as strongly as official figures imply. The broad argument is that if the Russian economy has genuinely expanded as much as it's reporting to, then you would expect to see supporting evidence in other data sets: energy usage, commercial activity, industrial output, transport movements, and nighttime brightness. However, according to assessments discussed by Swedish officials, some of the indicators appear weaker than the headline GDP numbers suggest. Now, immediately some people may say that this proves Russia is lying. I don't think we can go as far as that just yet, but I do think it's fair to say that Sweden is raising some very serious questions. And they're not the only ones, because when you start looking at the wider Russian economy, there are a number of things that don't quite fit with the image of a booming economy. So if we start with interest rates, Russia's central bank pushed interest rates to 21% at their peak. If you just think about that for a moment, 21%. If you've got a mortgage, imagine if you were paying above 21% because there's going to be a profit margin added on top of that base level by the bank. If you're a business trying to borrow money for a new project, then that's going to make your project completely uneconomic. Interest rates at these levels basically make borrowing really, really expensive. Now, the rate has come down to around about 14.5%, but central banks don't usually keep rates at these levels unless they're trying to deal with significant inflationary pressures or serious economic imbalances. Yet at the same time, official inflation figures have been considerably lower. That discrepancy has raised eyebrows amongst economists around the world. Then we have the labour shortages. Russia is currently facing one of the most severe labour shortages in its history. Businesses across multiple sectors are struggling to recruit staff. Construction companies just can't find enough people. There's nobody to fill the jobs for manufacturing businesses. Agriculture is really struggling to find people to actually pick the harvesters. Service industries are totally obliterated right now. And part of the reason for this is obvious. Hundreds of thousands of working age men have either entered military service or been drawn into defence-related industries as part of the shift to the wartime economy. At the same time, large number of skilled workers left Russia following mobilization and the uncertainty created by war. They didn't want to hang around and face the risk of being forced to go to Ukraine. So as a result of that, the labour pool in Russia has shrunk. And when workers become scarce, wages rise. And when wages rise rapidly, inflation starts to appear, which once again brings us back to the extraordinarily high interest rates. Everything starts fitting together when you think about the bigger picture. Perhaps the most important point of all is understanding what GDP actually measures, because this is where many people get confused. GDP measures economic activity, so it measures spending, it measures production, but what it doesn't necessarily measure is prosperity. If the government is spending billions building tanks, then GDP will rise. If the government spends building, producing artillery shells, then guess what? GDP will go up. And if the government recruits hundreds of thousands of soldiers and pays them inflated salaries, then guess what? GDP is going to go up again. So all of that will show up in the GDP figures for Russia, but it doesn't necessarily make for a strong civilian economy. It doesn't improve productivity, and it doesn't improve living standards for people in Russia. And it certainly does not guarantee long-term economic success for the economy. So that is why many analysts are increasingly talking about whether there are two Russian economies right now. On one side, you have the military-industrial economy, defense factories, weapons production, military procurement, state-funded activity. That part of the economy remains extremely busy because it's being funded directly by the Kremlin. On the other side, you have the civilian economy, businesses struggling with labour shortages, companies facing borrowing costs of double-digit numbers, potentially 15 to 20% or more, consumers dealing with high levels of inflation, and investment projects are now being shelved or completely cancelled. And according to a growing number of analysts, the gap between these two economies is becoming increasingly pronounced. Even Russia's own forecasts have become more cautious. Growth projections have been revised lower, now down to about 0.4% for 2026. Budget pressures have increased because Russia is continuing to spend huge amounts on the war. Oil and gas revenues remain under pressure compared with previous years, and concerns continue to be raised by Russian business leaders about borrowing costs and labour shortages. Now, none of this means that the Russian economy is about to collapse tomorrow, but the question is whether the official figures coming out of Russia are telling us the whole story. And that's basically the question that Sweden is asking, and makes this a fascinating discussion. How do you independently verify what's happening inside a country if you're not convinced that the figures are correct? And if you're involved in a major conflict like Russia and you're facing lots of sanctions, then you might not want to give all of that information out. And that's basically what's happening. And so the answer to that is that you have to look elsewhere. You look at things like energy consumption, transport data, trade flows, interest rates, the labour market. And when you look down from space, the pictures are telling you a different story to what Russia is. So whilst governments can control statistics, it's a lot harder to control what satellites can see. So does all of this mean that Sweden is right, that Russia is overstating its figures? Well, when you look at the satellite imagery, the labour shortages, the interest rates, the budget pressures, and the growing dependence on military spending, there's definitely a common theme emerging. Russia's economy may be considerably more complicated than the headline growth numbers suggest. And I think that's why this is a really interesting story. Not because we've got some satellite images which show that Russia isn't quite as bright as it used to be, but because of what all of the different parts of this story are telling us when you add it all together. This is a complicated jigsaw that we're still trying to get around, but hopefully you've got a little bit more insight having shared this information with you. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you've found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. I'm trying to get you thinking in different ways. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. My competition that you can win my property or a cash alternative prize is closing at 5 p.m. UK time on Friday, the 12th of June. That's this Friday, so you've only got a couple of days left to get involved. If you want to do so, scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Good luck if you're entering the draw. Hope you manage to win. Thank you to everyone who's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you. Really helps me to make as many videos as I can.